He's got one on the Chinese dating market. You see that? The Chinese dating market is cooked.
So at this point, there's no doubt that the dating market in China has skyrocketed to, I don't know how many levels of difficult there is, but it's pretty high up there. So not only has the number of single men drastically increased, but the amount of people who are now actively leaving the dating scene is on the rise as well. And I kind of respect that, you know, that you can't always just leave.
Sorry, what? 800 women attend matchmaking event, no men show up? Okay.
Dating scene is on the rise as well. And I kind of respect that.
But there's more men than women.
You can't always just leave. That's always an option. Now, this has led to an interesting moment where we actually get to see the effects of voluntary and involuntary celibacy affecting the wider economy. God, what a sentence. Okay, for example, because less and less couples are getting married each year, we see a decline in the maternity industry, which checks out. And whilst the media tries not to explicitly make the following connections, we know that more and more people becoming single has got to be the reason, or at least a contributing factor, towards why the pet industry is now slowly rising to a major part of China's economy.
They're just millennials too. China, we have more in common than you think, bro. We're just global millennials. We all just have heckin' doggos.
And pretty much at this point, everybody knows that the dating scene has hit rock bottom. But when it comes to actually facing the issue together, the relevant stakeholders at hand, which is pretty much every single participant within the dating market, are not necessarily uniting their method of approach to tackle the topic of discussion. And this, of course, includes the percentage of the couples population who I know for a fact are dying to get a piece of this pie, which is actually none of my business, by the way. But y'all are scat. Unless it's consensual. Regardless, the point of this rambling here is supposed to tell you that both dating market participants and wider Chinese society continue to hold the opinion that the problem should be addressed. But not everybody takes the same approach in how they participate within the dating market. As the old saying goes, all paths lead to Rome, but not everybody takes the same path. The second part is not the old saying, it's the first part, but like, you get what I'm trying to... Traditionalists, for example, often made up by a slightly more mature audience base, believes the solution towards fixing the dating market and the singleness epidemic is to repatch the arranged marriage meter, because it's one of the only services that exists where you get full transparency on what you're supposedly getting into. But the downside towards this method of approach is that you get very little say on who your partner is actually going to be. Personally, I think that's a little counterintuitive, because in the scenario where you rush into a relationship where you haven't spent enough time and effort to get to know each other to the full extent, there are of course other issues as well that can arise, for example, like having a lack of trust within the relationship because you didn't spend enough time building it in the first place.
Marriage gotcha fixes everything. You really gotta pray you get a 5-star waifu. And they gotta pray. They really gotta pray they're getting at least a fucking 3-star husbando here. You know, I feel like the odds are bad, dude. The odds are bad. You can't really re-roll in an arranged marriage.
And I swear to God, this is an actual complaint I've seen before. It's the fact that the agency or the broker offers no customer support hotline for when the relationship doesn't work out post-purchase. Fair enough. I mean, if you're gonna make it a service, at least make it comprehensive. Idealists, on the other hand, are made up by a slightly more innocent and younger generation, and believe the solution to fixing the problem is, of course, reviving authentic connections. This basically just means more people need to take the initiative in putting themselves in environments where it can happen naturally. Because honestly, it's actually pretty important to have the idea that fundamentally, love should happen when it's at the right moment, and romance should feel spontaneous and not forced. And whilst this is a great solution on paper, the method here adopts the assumption that everybody has great social skills and hobbies worth talking about, and has the mental and social capability of striking up an interesting conversation with a stranger in a public space. Now, here's an interesting and extremely niche report conducted by Seoul and the University of Shanghai. It was a collaborative approach that found the amount of people that are finding it easy to socialize with one another is slowly decreasing with each new generation.
Yikes.
Even when asked about how they feel doing it in their favorite hobby circles. Now take what you will out of that information, but you gotta remember one thing. All they did was just ask 3,000 people of their current user base, so maybe take it with a grain of salt. Now somewhere between the middle, we have more and more people adopting the realist build. Believe that love is possible only through dedication and hard work towards self-improvement. Now they don't make the mistake in idealizing romance, because love is part emotions and part logistics, and as long as you put in the work, you will get your reward proportionally in return to what you have to offer.
I see, you just have to face
In fact, I dare say some
max.
People watching right now would agree to this idea and would hold their ground and stand firm in subscribing to this idea. Well, that's until you hear about this story. Meet Li Hua, a 25-year-old top 50 global university graduate with a stable job and income and ownership of property and car in the city of Jinan. Now, he was surprisingly having a little bit of difficulty finding a suitable partner despite being on already 10 to 20 dates. And the counter-argument to cases like Li's, which naturally presents itself in the eyes of the realists, is that there's always a magic number to your problem, because the nature of statistics tells us supposedly, that the easiest way to
100
increase the
more dates.
likelihood of something happening is to rinse and repeat within your realms of possibilities until it
Get
happens. But
mewing?
my carefully curated counter-argument to that is, of course, Li Hua's story happened 11 years ago. He's still single. Now, I actually wasn't going to include the full story, but upon reading his full experience, I'm not joking when I say this is possibly the biggest L I've ever seen in my 25 years of life. Okay, so Lee actually went on his very first blind date back in 2014, arranged by his family through a matchmaking service. Now, this is how he documents the interaction, okay? He still remembers that first girl.
Okay, I just want to say, I mean, if everything else is going for him, he's got this good job, property, whatever, looks like, is it possible he's just a fucking miserable person to talk to? Is it possible it's like he's just got a really horrendous personality? Like, I'm not saying, again, the odds are stacked in China because there's more men than women and it's difficult, and I get that, but is it possible he has, I'm not like a normal bad, like really bad.
She was stunning, like influencer level beauty, and that's without filters, just naturally gorgeous. Now, the girl was actually a student counselor at the University of Jinan, which is where this man works. And apparently, she thought Mr. Lee was decent as well. But here's the twist. Lee chose not to pursue her. And when prompted the question why, in his own words, he claimed that she was just too good. I felt like I didn't deserve her. Not only was she beautiful, but she was mature, ambitious, extremely capable in social settings, the full package. And this is the line that sent me, okay? Being with her felt like I was a level 1 player going up against a max level boss. It just...
This is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm worried about, bro. This is what I was worried about. It's very Clark Kent energy, actually. Yeah, he's got everything going for him and he fucks it up. He's a wall cell.
Mr. Lee said meeting someone like that made him feel like she was out of reach, way out of his league. Now, since that date onwards, Lee stopped being skeptical of matchmaking. He thought to himself, if that's the kind of person I can meet, maybe it's worth trying. Lee then went on to complete 123 more matches, spending an estimated
Dude, putting Legal Edges in the background is very funny.
range of 50,000 to 100,000
He's rage queuing into the dating market, dude.
and throughout the process with no success. Now, I want to be honest with you here. If this was my dating career, the only way you can possibly find this out is if I physically died and someone left it in my will. This might just be the biggest fumble in history. Then, of course, we have the materialists, who don't exactly fall into the spectrum in a traditional sense, because like the idealists who also chase a concept of romance, or a version of love that perfectly aligns with their desired lifestyle, many materialists would argue that they're just being honest about the harsh modern realities, especially in a dating economy where the cost of being in a relationship has just never been higher. And of course, when you then follow up with the question,
is it higher?
What does that all mean? Most of them will just tell you they want someone who's hot, rich, and loyal. The reality, of course, when it comes to seeing die-hard materialists in action, they usually just reduce their cutthroat criteria of hot, rich, and loyal down to a more realistic criteria. 2 out of the 3. That's all you get. And you know, my advice here is that if you do come across these type of people in your social network, instead of contemplating whether or not they're a good demographic of people to involve yourself romantically with, you can always just become their good friend instead, because whilst they don't always have the most romantic relationship, they always have the best stories to tell. I love you guys. But personally, I think it's kind of unfair to hold an entire single population, whether fragmented or not, collectively hostage and then demand a magic solution from them. Because most of what's killing the dating market today are things that no one group of people or demographic can actually fix or reasonably control. Because whilst things like gender imbalance, rising cost of living, looks inflation, consumer dating culture, dating fatigue, and overall distrust towards the opposite gender, decline in social skills amongst men in the Zoomer population can all be attributing factors towards why people are becoming single, we all know that the real reason is simply because the best dating show in history hasn't dropped a decent season in years. So I think in order to understand the current state of the dating market, we'll need to first begin simplifying the problem. And to achieve that, you can kind of think of the willingness to escape single life as a spectrum that you can stand on. For example, people who care about being single and people who don't. With people who care about being single likely spending the most amount of time and effort to escape their current situation, whereas people who don't spend relatively much less effort and urgency to escape. For example, if Xiaoming, sitting at one end of the spectrum, cares a lot about being single, then he may potentially be willing to spend up to 300,000 yuan a year just to sign up to a VIP diamond tier matchmaking service in hopes that he'll be introduced to the perfect woman. He knows that statistically speaking, the chances of finding a good and successful match in the short run is very low. episode. But he does it anyways because he fears nothing. Then Xiaohong, sitting on the other end of the spectrum, who is generally unbothered or nonchalant about being single, would more likely find the idea of meeting someone naturally by spending most of her time in social or hobby circles she enjoys to be the right play. But we all know the real intellectual powerhouse here is actually Xiao Wang, who would just have his mom cross-post his stats in the city square marriage market and all relevant social platforms and wait for the results to come in themselves. And of course, when we're on the topic of dating and marriage and parental influence, the same research that we talked about earlier, the one
meta is crazy,
Shanghai, suggests that parental pressure is still one of the biggest influencing factors when it comes to shaping children's views on dating and marriage. Now, this is actually a good statistic to have because now we can factor in parental pressure as a key driving point in the phenomenon we see in Chinese dating market today. For example, people who care about being single with parental pressure is more likely to participate in matchmaking and other fast-track dating methods because they have a much greater sense of urgency to escape single life and meet obligations. People who don't care about being single but have parental pressure on their backs could potentially either turn to dating apps or attempt to find meaningful personal connections through more organic routes like hobbies and friendship groups, or establish communities in order to find the right partner. But it does run the risks of having no urgency, which can lead to the individual spending the majority of their youth in semi-serious situationships that doesn't lead to fruitful outcomes in the long run. Now, people who don't care about being single with no parental pressure, how does it feel? But of course, at the end of the day, another great soft skill to have that translate into dating success is of course the ability to communicate your emotions clearly and concisely to the other party. So say what you mean. You'll do everyone a favor. And even though 62% of Chinese Gen Z respondents believe the concept of marriage is frightening, I think a tip that you can always remember to help you feel a little better is that how can you be scared of the concept of marriage when the issue of the singleness epidemic is not solved in the first place? Just so you know, if I'm found incapacitated in the streets after the release of this video, I probably deserved it. And of course, up to this point, there are people left that I haven't really covered, and these are what I like to call outliers of the dating market. Because whilst the singleness epidemic is a standard issue across dating market participants, it doesn't necessarily affect everybody to the same degree. Some people are drowning in love, while others are drowning in loneliness. I mean, you're both technically drowning, but only one of them actually wants to die. So from the male side of the outlier spectrum, we have people who can successfully pull off the Jackson Wang haircut. In fact, the whole spectrum might as well just be called how much do you look like Jackson Wang on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is single because he's literally Jackson Wang, and dating will only negatively affect his generational run. On the female side of the spectrum, and perhaps the true apex predators of the whole dating market, who's never really suffered from the singleness epidemic, is the tier 1 city rich single auntie with no kids. And whilst the individual's initial reaction to entering this kind of relationship may be to question whether or not it's actually real love, the feeling will quickly fade away after a few sips of your $15 milk tea riding shotgun in her Bentley Continental. Now, despite being on top of the food chain, there are still issues that plague the Ivy League equivalent of daters within the Chinese dating market, and that is the concept of expectation to reality. And this essentially just refers to how many people that actually exists in the population that satisfies your criteria. For example, if you're satisfied with somebody with an ordinary job, not too ugly, and has the ability to support a family, that's approximately 80% of the population. If you're looking for an attractive and well-established individual with a high-paying private sector job and a well-established social circle, the figure then sits at roughly 10%. If you're looking for a bilingual, well-groomed man with wealth, power, and status so untouchable even celebrities cannot hold a candle to him, please feel free to submit your application to the State Council. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Okay, Xi Jinping. You know he's pulling. You know Xi's on the apps, tearing it up. Funny vids. Jigao, check him out. Those are funny.